I was someone who used to run my own business and was very involved in the startup and management of many more too, before politics became all-encompassing. First of all, I think I'd like to say that if you were a small business in 1975, I probably wouldn't blame you for voting in the last referendum to stay in, because you were lied to, basically, to be very, very blunt. You were lied to about it being a vote to just join the common market. You were lied to when you were told that any talk of the UK running headlong into full fiscal, political and monetary union with loss of sovereignty, an end to border control and all the rest of it was just scaremongering. And of course, social and economic conditions at the time made voting to stay in look very attractive too. There were two major world power blocks in existence, the USSR and the USA, and so there was a case for creating a powerful European bloc, not just for us, but especially our near neighbours France, who, let's not forget, had lost wars to Germany 3 times in recent memory. And the new emerging markets that we have today, China, India, Russia, Brazil, nobody believed that they were going to be world players back then. And there was no integrated global supply chain either, no internet, no online commerce. Trading in harmony with your near neighbours was sensible and often as good as it got, particularly in 1970s when Britain suffered a long-running period of economic malaise with severe inflation, strikes, enormous union power, which neither the Labour or the Conservative governments of Heath or Wilson had been able to halt. We were the poor man of Europe, but of course that was then, this is now, and it's a very different scenario. We have a global economy. The internet has made international trade possible at the click of a button, and the routine use of container shipping facilities makes moving goods around the world a lot cheaper and a lot easier. So I think now the European Union is a very 20th century idea, but we're living in the 21st century, and the EU is diminishing in terms of world economic standing. It's down from 37% of GDP when we joined in 1973 to just 18% now, despite getting bigger and bigger. There were 9 members when we joined, there are now 28 members. And it's just not working for us anymore, it's dragging us down. Particularly, I think, the EU's push for harmonisation, this nannying idea that everything has got to be the same right across the continent, is not really good for entrepreneurship and innovation. As you know, if you're going to build, develop, grow a business, you need to be different, you need to be ahead of the crowd, you need to keep thinking up new markets, new customer bases. And I think what's happening is the EU has just had such a tight control on everything that it's actually hampering business expansion at the same time that it's raising costs. So I've spoken to plenty of businessmen and women who believe if it wasn't for the huge weight of EU regulations, their businesses could be twice as big, twice as profitable, and employ twice as many people. This is obviously something that the Federation of Small Businesses has looked into, and they recently did a survey of 6,000 of their members, and 61% cited regulatory burden as a significant factor in closing or downsizing. The laws that the EU brings are relentless. 3,580 between 2010 and 2013 alone. That's about 3 a day on average. The whole thing runs to about 13 million words, so it's great bedtime reading. You could spend at least 55 minutes every week getting through that lot. Now, let me just give you some examples of how the EU holds back business innovation. Shortly before we joined what was then the EEC, a very good friend of mine set up a chemicals company, mostly producing garden products, so lawn feed, fertilisers, plant food, and so on and so forth. His name's Jonathan Carr, and if you see a beautiful, smooth, weed-free, green, luscious bowling green, you can probably guarantee, because he supplies most of the bowling greens in this country, that it's his products helping keep it that way. And his business does very well, but he thinks he could do even better. He currently employs 70 people and believes it could be double were it not for the way the EU regulatory burden impacts his business. The only job creation that the EU has given him is that he now has to employ 2 people just to deal with the EU's accompanying regulations and accompanying paperwork and regulations. His name's Jonathan, and he says he's seen niche products that he's created over years, often at great expense, completely regulated out of existence, by excessive and contradictory EU regulations. And I'll give you just one example that he gave me. Ammonium sulfamate, okay? It's an extremely effective weed killer. Gets the damn things right down to the roots, so it's just the kind of weed killer you certainly want for those really tough plants. It was also particularly good for controlling tree stumps. However, it's expensive to produce, so the cost meant it was never a mass market product. And ultimately, the weight of compliance with EU regulations, which when it comes to chemicals, as I'm sure you can imagine, there are many, the expense of all that eventually became so overwhelming that the economies of scale led Jonathan to say, I can't afford to produce this anymore. Worse still, I said that this chemical was particularly good for controlling tree stumps. Well, the EU banned its use for that completely, although it still allows it to be used in fertilizers and compost accelerators. So it's not as though this product is dangerous. And it's things like this that actually make me wonder if sometimes there isn't a little panel of bureaucrats somewhere sat in an office in Brussels thinking, right, what around here works? Oh, there's a very powerful hairdryer. Oh, a 2,000 watt vacuum cleaner. Oh, it works. Let's break it. So another of contradictory and frankly bonkers regulations. I had a telephone call recently from a businessman who produces bottled water. He's based in the south of the east of England. And he'd come across this incredible anomaly. He'd got this fantastic idea to expand his business by producing a high-end, high-quality bottled water that had flecks of gold leaf floating in it. Now, you might think it's a crazy idea, and you might think you'd be mad to buy that kind of thing, but I absolutely support his right to try and sell it if he wants to. But you know what? He wasn't allowed to produce it, because although the EU lets you put gold leaf in vodka, you're not allowed to put it in water. So that was the end of what could have been a very innovative and exciting idea for his business. Now that's just two examples of two businesses that have been adversely affected by EU regulations, but of course the whole of this on every business in Britain, because let's not forget it is every business that is hampered by EU regulations, whether or not you're actually doing trade with the European Union. So it affects the economic productivity of the whole country. But by how much? Well, different organisations have come to different conclusions. I think it's fascinating that the government has never undertaken a thorough cost-benefit analysis. I can't think why. Perhaps they might be worried they'd get the wrong answer. But Business for Britain, the organisation that's helped set this up today, says the cost of Brussels red tape to British business was more than 18 billion in the 5 years between 2009 and 2014. Now, if you think that sounds a lot, the think tank Open Europe says they're wrong. That estimates the cost to the UK of the top 100 EU rules alone hit 33.3 billion in 2014. So that's almost double Business for Britain's estimate. What we do know is that in 2014, UK government ministers signed off 26 EU regulations that they knew, because their own impact assessments told them so, they knew the costs would outweigh the benefits. There are also, of course, numerous examples of how regulations and EU interference has reduced profitability in key industries. The sugar company, Tate & Lyle, has now closed 5 of the 6 factories it did have here in the UK since we joined the European Union. And that is primarily because of EU regulation which favours beet sugar, which is grown in Europe, over cane sugar grown outside Europe, which incurs astonishing tariffs of £300 per tonne. So the EU doesn't really care, unlike Jamie Oliver, it doesn't really care if you eat too much sugar, it just cares about what kind of sugar you're eating and where it comes from. And its protectionist attitude to shoring up the sugar industry in Europe at the expense of sugarcane growing areas outside the EU, particularly in Africa, where of course people are going to suffer. And I think there's something here too about an ethical point about the EU's policies helping to keep poor farmers in poorer parts of the world poor. The steel industry, well, we daily now have the issue of Port Talbot on our television screens, but that's not unique. You might also remember the closure of the steel factory in Redcar in October last year, forced out of business, like Port Talbot, because of high energy costs forced onto bills by EU energy policies and climate change directives. Small businesses. Recently the EU introduced, as you probably know, something called VATMOS, which is causing particular problems for micro businesses and the mumpreneur who will set up a business working for home, somebody like I used to be. And it really is the smallest businesses, the ones with the most stretched cash flow and a larger percentage of income that they need to put aside to comply with regulations, that are finding it difficult to manage. The big boys, it's quite easy for them. They can afford the extra staff to monitor the compliance, and of course they can afford expensive lobbyists to fight their corner over in Brussels. The small businessman and woman here in Britain doesn't have the resources to do that. So I think it's hardly surprising that more and more entrepreneurs and directors are making the case that British businesses will actually thrive outside the EU's clutches. They're recognising the truth on the bottom line on EU trade, and that is there is no risk to the EU leaving, because the EU needs us to buy from it more than we need it to buy from it. Spanish exports, for instance, £740 million worth of fruit to the UK alone. 421,000 Spanish jobs depend on that trade continuing. France, as you can imagine, exports rather a lot of wine to us, around £1.3 billion worth every year. Those experts keep 500,000 French men and women in work. Why would they want to stop trading with us? 1 million German jobs depend on the £16 billion worth of cars exported to the UK every year, and 300,000 Italian jobs, no pun intended, are supported by the EU because we buy £500 million worth of Italian shoes. We want the shoes, we want the cars, we definitely want the wine, they want the jobs and the income. Trade war, I'm sorry, nobody wants a trade war. It's just not going to happen. And I was very delighted a few years ago to hear the former Trade Minister, Digby Jones, say that trade between us and the EU is so important that we could probably agree a free trade deal within 48 hours, although of course we would still in any case be part of that free trade area that extends all the way from Iceland in the north to Turkey. So although the insider wheeling out their business heavyweights, and again it is the big business heavyweights to make the case to remain, although their former M&S boss Stuart Rose, I notice, can't always remember the name of the campaign that he's actually supporting, and he really loves the idea of paying migrants lower wages than people in Britain, which again is, I think, another ethical issue. I think we can more than match them on the Leave side with our own great business people who can talk about how they want to leave the EU. People like Sir Rocco Forte, who said the EU is a complete disaster, leaving wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference to my business. Lord Bamford, who's the chairman of JCB. Britain, we're the world's 5th largest economy. We could exist on our own peacefully and sensibly. Sir James Dyson, Britain should leave the EU so it's no longer dominated and bullied by the Germans. Very forthright view, that. Tim Tozer, the chairman of Vauxhall. It's unthinkable that the EU would shun a new trade deal with the UK should Britain vote to leave. Mark Astaire of Barclays Bank. The EU would continue to thrive outside the EU. Steve Hilton. Okay, he's not a businessman, but I love this quote, so I just had to put him in. He's David Cameron's former policy guru, and he says, Brussels is a vast, stinking cesspit of corporate corruption gussied up in the garb of idealistic internationalism. So forgive me for including that one, but I felt I had to. Nissan, Unilever, Siemens, Toyota, Airbus, all these companies and more have made it perfectly clear that they will not be going anywhere if we vote to leave. They will stay here, they will keep working here, they will keep providing jobs here, and they will keep thriving here. And their statements are an important part, I think, of the strong, positive case to be made to businesses for Brexit. And we have to get this message over, I think, because our entrepreneurs and company directors are not only going to be key to winning this referendum, they are the people who are going to be most adversely affected if we stay in. So I mentioned the Federation of Small Businesses survey. In that same survey, when they were asked about the impact of leaving on their businesses, 41% felt the EU would have a negative impact. Only 17% felt it would have a positive impact. But this isn't really quite the bad news that statistics and lies and damned lies and statistics might have us believe. 34% felt that leaving the EU would have no impact on their business, meaning if you add those last two stats together, a majority of just over 50% have clearly not been convinced by the argument that staying in will be bad for British business. And if you've done the maths, you probably think there's a remaining 8% who presumably didn't have a clue how to answer the question at all, and I'm hoping that entire 8% is here in this audience this morning and that I have managed to convince you. So I think to sum up, just a few very important pieces of business information. If the world's 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 7th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th and 13th biggest economies can survive and prosper outside the European Union, then so can the 5th, that is us. Of the 13 regional trade blocs worldwide, the EU is the only one that demands political union. We don't have to be in a political union to trade, still less one that is so obsessed with micromanagement that it's incapable of creating an environment where business will thrive. For me, the future of trade and the future ability of British businesses to trade with the EU depends on global economics, on mutual need and on strong business relationships, not on membership of a political union, where Britain's businesses will shine brightest and furthest after breakfast. So to sum up, I said I could forgive you for voting to stay in 1975, but now, if you're in business today, I think you'd be mad not to vote to leave.